This video is brought to you by Ground News. The foundational state of Germany is the Holy Roman Empire, founded by the Franks in 800, and despite claiming continuity with the Western Roman Empire that the Franks ironically helped destroy, the Holy Roman Empire was a very different entity entirely. The glue that held it together was a political system called feudalism, which the Franks had perfected during the rule over modern-day France. A system of liege in which regional lords swore their loyalty to a king in exchange for stewardship over land. As the Franks conquered Germany, the system was expanded to conquered kingdoms. No longer were those who swore loyalty mere knights, but also dukes and even kings who ruled far more than just a single castle. Throughout the 9th century, the Frankish partitions crystallized two separate kingdoms into existence. A Western Frankish kingdom, with smaller feudal lords under a more powerful king that would form the foundation of modern France, and an Eastern kingdom, ruling over significantly larger Italian, Czech, German, dukes, cities, and kings with a significantly weaker Kaiser, becoming the Holy Roman Empire through the Roman Church. The Kaiser was dependent upon the support of the various smaller dukes and bishops they ruled. They were elected by these and spent the first years of their rule touring the empire to dish out bribes and grants and positions to secure the loyalty of the regional rulers they depended upon. The smaller regions were vulnerable to the claims and ambitions of neighboring regions, so to secure themselves, the small regions would support the emperor to be just powerful enough to protect them, but not too powerful as to strip regions of their power entirely, while the emperor was the only one who could hand out special privileges in taxation and trade. By the High Middle Ages, an additional social development made this framework even more complex: urbanization. There is a German proverb that says "Stadtluft macht frei," which has its origins in the Middle Ages. Cities began growing as centers of commerce in the High Middle Ages, and within them it was neither aristocrats nor church hierarchies that held political power, but the craftsmen and trading guilds. A goldsmith, for example, who worked in the city of Constance, could over the years amass a considerable fortune and even drive neighboring aristocrats into debt to him. These craftsmen organized themselves into guilds for protection, regulated the city economies, and effectively ruled them. Constance became what is called a Reichsstadt, or imperial city, by 1192. A Reichsstadt was a city that stood under the direct authority of the emperor. These were often also called a Freistaat, or free city, because becoming such a city meant enormous autonomy in political matters. The city paid a certain amount of tax to the emperor directly, but could largely make their own political decisions. Aachen, Dortmund, Köln, Bremen, Lübeck, Hamburg, and Metz were among the most famous of these free cities. These cities arranged treaties among themselves and even with cities outside of the Holy Roman Empire, creating alliances and shared spheres of trade, the most famous of which would become the Hanseatic League. Through this, more treaties upon treaties of special privileges and rights were mixed into an already complex system of liege and privileges in the wider Holy Roman Empire. As the Middle Ages came to an end, free developments would strengthen this regionalism even more. First, the Reformation. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, despite the enormous amount of agreements and treaties that had made these regions distinct polities and the substantial differences in language and culture, there was still one overarching factor that unified all of them besides the imperial crown: Christendom. All these entities saw themselves under one common religion. The Protestant Reformation shredded this arrangement. A common faith could no longer act as a means to bind all of this together. Regionalism consequently deepened, and the common national identity based on common language began to gradually emerge as the factor that unified peoples. Second, print and paper. The printing press not only brought newspapers and books, but also the written contract. What gradually began happening is that all the guarantees of autonomy in aspects of law and taxation, the entire system of interconnected dependencies and the pledges of liege that made the Holy Roman Empire function, began being written down and put to paper. And because the Holy Roman Empire was such an enormously entangled system of different systems of liege and fealty, putting it all to paper in contract form and legal code ended up creating an ungodly amount of paper. Papers that had to be managed, archived, catalogued, thereby creating even more paper, and thereby creating a labyrinth of paperwork to navigate for any political or state function to even work. From henceforth, whatever politically developed in Germany, this monstrosity of its own creation, the famous German paper bureaucracy, stood at the center. Third, the emergence of Prussian militarism. The ultimate consequence of the Protestant Reformation was the 30 Years' War. It flung the Holy Roman Empire into decades of warlordism. Cities and lords paid warlords to march vast armies of mercenaries through the country. And one of the biggest impacts of the 30 Years' War in Germany was on a previously somewhat obscure state called Prussia. During the 30 Years' War, Prussia was spared the devastation that had ravaged most of Germany, but still learned its lessons on building standing armies. And even more important, while most Protestant Germans were Lutherans, the Prussians became Calvinists. Calvinists emphasized the importance of creating public institutions that guard over a common moral good. In Calvinism, there's also a theological concept called sovereign spheres, a belief that each segment of society ought to be accountable to managing its own specific tasks. And the Prussian Calvinists were also moral Puritanists. When the 30 Years' War finally came to an end, the aristocratic family that ruled Prussia spent a century dismantling the regionalized feudal structures and building a highly centralized, absolutist state. The two main tools they used to accomplish this was militarism combined with Calvinist Puritanism. After abolishing the regional militias of smaller feudal lords, they introduced a tax to maintain a centralized standing army in its stead, and to appease the regional aristocrats, they made them the officers of the standing army. At the same time, the French kings massacred French Calvinists, more commonly known as the Huguenots. The Hohenzollerns invited the survivors to come to Prussia as refugees, and once there, the Hohenzollerns specifically made those French Protestant refugees the administrators of their new state. This had a significant impact for two reasons. First, in France, the process of building a bureaucratic, centralized state had already begun centuries before, and the Huguenots now brought the knowledge and the experience of running a centralized state bureaucracy with them to help create a centralized Prussian bureaucracy. Second, because these new bureaucrats were largely Frenchmen, disconnected from the regional customs, norms, and aristocratic relations, it gave the Prussian bureaucracy a large degree of independence from the networks and connections that Prussian feudal lords had. This made it difficult to build networks of favoritism, nepotism, and clientelism within the new state bureaucracy of the Prussian state. The Prussian state was through this able to disband feudal favoritism in its state. The regional feudal lords still kept their estates and were able to gain wealth through them as private businesses, a process amplified by Calvinist theology which emphasizes the importance of private property and commerce. A large class of business magnates began to dominate Prussia, in contrast to the small family business structures that developed in the rest of Germany. Most importantly, the aristocrats voluntarily submitted their political autonomy to the newly centralized Prussian bureaucracy in exchange for becoming the officers of the army that became the central organ of the state. This new class of land-owning, wealthy military leaders became known as the Junkers. This is how the Prussian monarchy managed to do what other European states significantly struggled with: subdue the aristocracy. But the most overlooked thing, and therefore something I really want to emphasize, was the influence of Calvinist Protestant moral Puritanism in the development of the Prussian institutions. The infamous Prussian strictness has its origins in this, an obsession with moral purity and rooting out any supposed degeneracy, the harsh corporeal punishments for even the slightest of misconduct, the rigorously enforced austerity in financial matters no matter if public or private, the shunning of extravagance and indulgences. All of this was essential in shaping what Prussia became. Among some Western conservatives, Prussia has this weird romanticized reputation of being a supposed enlightened authoritarianism. In reality, it is the place where the last witch burnings of Europe happened. This Protestant Puritanism also flowed into the creation of a Prussian army, and that army therefore ended up being seen as the primary center and expression of Protestant Christian moral virtues. Marching grounds appeared close to all public places. Service in the army was seen as the ultimate moral virtue, and therefore the army was particularly strictly observant to hold up to these Protestant virtues. What began to develop here through the combination of Protestant Puritanism with militarism is something that in Germany is called Obrigkeitsgehörigkeit, a sort of blind and unconditional obedience to authority. Through combining Protestant Puritanism with militarism, Prussia created an institution in which obedience to authority became seen as the greatest moral virtue. The underlying idea here is that the purpose of the state is not to legislate or regulate, but to be a moral authority, that the state must be powerful, centralized, and exists for the purpose of strictly enforcing and policing moral purity. It is important to note, though, that it is unwise to blame Protestantism or religion in general for the creation of this institution. At exactly the same time, there was another Calvinist nation in Europe, the Netherlands, and there, Calvinist Puritanism combined with an emphasis on building a prosperous society of virtue through education and labor resulted in the creation of a decentralized state and societal structures of tolerance. There was an important difference here. The Dutch Calvinists did not believe that the purpose of the state was to be a moral authority. For them, the only moral authority was the Bible, and the Bible could not manifest itself into a state. Religion is a powerful social force and political force. Few things can bind people together stronger under common social norms in a social contract than religion. Bringing religion into politics always means that you can rally people tightly behind goals. But it depends on what those goals are. Religion in politics can have many different outcomes, many of which are in fact unintentional. The Puritanism of Protestant New England settlers ironically ended up creating a secular republic. So what makes Prussia so different? One of the most important lessons that the development of the Prussian state should teach us is that to build the institutions of state with the intention of making the state an authority to police and enforce concepts of morality is very dangerous. In the previous video, I talked about the difference between a high-trust society and a low-trust society. And I guess I worded myself badly in that video because many in the audience saw this as a binary choice, a very simple choice between good and bad. But that is not the case. I think it is better for us to see the difference between low-trust and high-trust society as a scale. Yes, low-trust societies can completely undermine a social contract. At the ultimate endpoint of the low-trust society scale stand disasters like Somalia. Prussia created a high-trust society by taking Protestant social norms of moral purity and turning them into the purpose of the state. But this high-trust society would in the coming centuries drive into the extreme end of the high-trust society scale. Because eventually a state that is created to be the ultimate pinnacle of moral virtue becomes a state that cannot be questioned. And it is here at the ultimate extreme of the high-trust society scale that we end up with a totalitarian hellscape. The Prussian institutions of unquestioning obedience to authority are what enabled the eventual rise of Nazism. The extreme end of a high-trust society is a place where everyone unconditionally obeys authority and surrenders any and all agency to it. A place where everyone constantly seeks to ruthlessly root out any impurity. Do not assume that the more trust there is in a high-trust society, the better that society is. Because the ultimate high-trust society is a totalitarian nightmare, infinitely worse than any collapsing low-trust society. I believe that a key lesson that all of us should learn from the creation and development of the Prussian state is that you should be extremely suspicious of anyone who advocates that the purpose of the state is to be a moral authority and enforcer of moral purity. Such institutions are among the most dangerous that exist, even if you can secularize them. We are currently living through a rise of right-wing populist movements throughout Western democracies who also see the state as a tool to enforce moral purity, including in Germany itself with the increasing popularity of the AfD. A quick look at the news will show you the different narratives which contribute to the stoking of ongoing tensions in German politics. Ground News found more than 120 sources covering the rise of the AfD in Germany from across the world, with differences in balance on reporting across the political spectrum. Comparing the coverage, I can see how this right-leaning source straight out of Germany calls the supposed left-wing extremists protesting against the AfD violent, while this far-left outlet, based in the United States, reports an AfD politician supposedly spat on a demonstrator while police stopped protesters from breaking through barriers. As you can see, important context like where a publication is based and their political bias can influence the framing of a story and therefore public opinion. Additionally, Ground News also shows me a timeline of who broke the news so I can see how a narrative has changed over time. I have used Ground News for over 2 years now in both how I get my news and also in my channel research for videos on contemporary issues. Their mission statement aligns with what I believe, diving deeply into issues, looking into different biases, providing context and promoting informed discussions, all of which I believe contribute to building a healthier media environment. Especially useful right now as the world's democracies grapple with stark social divisions on issues like immigration, the economy, the war in Ukraine, Israel-Palestine conflict, globalization, and more, which combined have led to the rise of populist political forces seeking to take advantage of insecurity and public discontent. Which is why I can really recommend that you subscribe to Ground News to stay fully informed on these issues. Go to ground.news/Kraut or scan the QR code on screen. My viewers will save up to 40% on the same top-tier Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all of their features. By subscribing, you also support the content that I create here. Thank you to Ground News. At the same time as Prussia was building its militaristic state, an unintended consequence of a previous political development could be seen happening in the Rhine Valley. Denis Papin was a French professor for mathematics. In the 1670s, he developed a basic steam engine that he called a steam digester. Being a Protestant, he was expelled from Catholic France in 1679 and sought refuge in the Protestant German trade city of Marburg, where he worked as a professor. There he further developed his steam digester, creating a basic piston engine, and by 1705 Papin had built the first ever steamboat. He intended to sail his steamboat up and down the Rhine, eventually into the North Sea and on to London to convince everyone of the value of his innovation and sell it. But you all probably never heard of him. In fact, most of you probably think that James Watt invented the steam engine. And there's a reason for this. Even before making his trips, the Boatmen's Guild in Germany, a trade city guild that had a monopoly on managing all business conducted via boats on rivers, heard of his innovation. They perceived the steamboat as dangerously disruptive to their established ways of doing business. Papin was to them an upstart who was never in the guild, had come along with an innovation that would completely disrupt their trade and ruin the jobs of many. When Papin's boat arrived in the German town of Münden, the Boatsmen's Guild seized the boat and smashed it to pieces. In the Middle Ages, the trade and craftsmen guilds had been established as a means by which to protect the craftsmen and their cities from the power of aristocrats. By the time the Industrial Revolution reared its head, these same structures ended up becoming the primary opposition to any and all innovation in the German economy, establishing an institution of protectionism around the established business structures of the country. A core component of the German economic institution thereby became a hostility toward innovation and change in the economy. Meanwhile, the Prussians had established themselves as the second most powerful entity of the Holy Roman Empire by kicking the Austrians out of Silesia. They began gaining territory within the German mainland, and because they did not share in the protectionist system, they were able to industrialize earlier than all other German states, just as the French Revolution happened next door and the Corsican came rolling through Germany. Napoleon is in many ways the man who created the modern idea of Germany. Unintentionally, but still. When Napoleon invaded, the Austrians disbanded the Holy Roman Empire, and when Napoleon occupied large parts of Germany, he could not understand why the Germans didn't welcome him as a liberator from their kleptocratic lords. Germans began guerrilla campaigns of resistance against the French in so-called free corps formed by students. The uniform colors of students that launched attacks on French troops is where the German flag comes from. The resistance to French occupation shaped a common course to create a unified German identity. Once Napoleon was gone, the remainder of the German 1800s would be shaped by the struggle to achieve that. A liberal revolution of 1848 failed to create a unified German state, and ultimately it would be Prussia that succeeded in unification. The means by which Prussia did so would be by force. After creating a unified German empire, the Prussians imported their state structures and tried to force them upon the rest of Germany, where they primarily tried to destroy both regionalism and economic protectionism. The Kulturkampf is probably the most famous example of this, in which Prussian rulers of the new unified Germany attempted to crack down on Catholicism throughout this new state. Essential to this project was the Prussian Junker class, the landed gentry from the east, who had 2 centuries before surrendered their feudal privileges in exchange of becoming officers and ministers. Prussian Junker magnates now pushed Prussian industrialization upon the rest of Germany at breakneck speed, enshrining Calvinist conceptions of property rights, building factory cities that depopulated large swathes of the countryside, and engaged in clashes with socialist movements and labor unions. Political scientists refer to this unified German state that the Prussians created as the Reichsstaat, a sort of libertarian authoritarianism that had property rights enshrined as the most important legal principle, but lacked any and all political accountability, since the Chancellor was not elected but appointed by the Kaiser. This state had low taxes, a small but highly centralized and powerful state in Berlin, the purpose of which was not to regulate or legislate, but to enforce and police strict Protestant moral puritanism and the property rights of the industrial magnates. Side note, The fringe political ideology of anarcho-monarchism basically developed out of considering this the perfect type of social organization. Since the Renaissance, the laws of Germany had been Roman law, which vested the powers of the state through God upon an emperor to legislate. The Prussians now centered this legal framework fully around the Kaiser and his bureaucrats. The Obrigkeit of the monarch now stood as the sole center and enactor of the authority of the state. And to rule, the Prussian monarch had since the 1600s relied on the bureaucracy originally built by Calvinist French refugees to enact law and legislate. As Prussia now ruled a wider Germany, they now transformed the German civic bureaucracy with their army of powerful clerks and administrators. Systems of certificates, as honor-bound agreements, make place for streamlined systems of contract and uniform legal text. The German bureaucracy that had developed in previous centuries now became a judicial machine of substantial legal power. The Prussians vested enormous powers into a bureaucratic machinery, and the individual clerks that oversaw the minute details of everyday interactions the citizens had with the state thereby became very powerful. The powerful clerk, or Beamte, is a German stereotype that came into existence here. This was a process amplified by Prussian militarism. The quote attributed to Voltaire that most states have an army but the Prussian army has a state is very much true. People often forget just how militaristic this state was. Everything from schools to post offices was uniformed and worked under a militaristic order. Now combine this with the bureaucracy, its powerful clerks, and Obrigkeitgehörigkeit, and you receive a state of cold, inhumane, militaristic efficiency that expects from its society to obey each and every bureaucrat like a military officer. There is a famous incident that occurred in the town of Köpenick that shows just how ridiculous all of this could get. A con man by the name of Wilhelm Voigt managed to tailor together the uniform of a captain of the Prussian Guards regiment. Wearing this uniform, he walked up to a group of soldiers who were on exercise and ordered them to follow him. And they did. He marched them into the town hall, ordered the soldiers to arrest the mayor, to crack open the safe, and hand over to him the contents of the city treasury. And remarkably, this robbery worked. Obrigkeitsgehörigkeit, the institutionalized virtue of obeying a superior, had become so entrenched in Prussian society and gradually across Germany that people did not question what appeared as authority, even when its demands were absurd. The Köpenick example might be somewhat comedic, but when you think of hundreds of thousands of men obediently marching into French machine gun fire in 1917, this obedience to authority reveals itself for just how sinister it could be and would ultimately become.